Hi, my name's Briar Harris. I am the other half of the ESA NFIP integration team at FEMA Region 10 with Aaron Cooper. And today we're going to talk about in this module how to take all of the Endangered Species Act requirements and the BiOp implementation that Aaron mentioned in the earlier module and what that actually looks like on the ground when we're doing our local permitting decisions for development that's proposed in the special flood hazard areas of our communities. So here we have the logo for the National Flood Insurance Program. Most of us are aware of it, and I use it here just because I think it's such a great indication, a great depiction of where the focus and emphasis has been with traditional floodplain management. The things that we are familiar with, with managing at the local level are things like elevating structures, making sure that, lowest floors are properly vented, elevation certificates and whatnot. So all of these things that are part of traditional floodplain management really have to do with making sure that people build thoughtfully in the flood hazard areas to, minimize their risk from those flood hazards. And that's what this picture really is about. It's where the built environment comes into contact with or conflict with water. But another sort of facet of the way that we manage floodplain development at the local level is that it's on a property by property basis, right? And so when we are looking at managing development kind of in those postage stamp viewpoints, one thing at a time, you'll have a property owner come in who wants to do, let's say, some erosion control and I don't know, a fish cleaning table on their property. And it's hard to really conceptualize and especially to explain why something at that scale, it might be just 50 feet long. It might be a 10 by 10 square foot building. I mean, how that's going to affect really the quality and function of habitat on a river the size of the Snohomish. But the way that we do floodplain management, though, is after you've permitted that development and you've closed, you've done your inspections and made sure it's complied, it really kind of vanishes. Each one of these decisions happens in a vacuum, but then you get a neighbor who comes in and wants the same thing, and another neighbor, and and maybe what's allowed grows a little bit, and you have a larger footprint, and all of a sudden you have a much more easily identifiable impact on habitat on the river. You have a whole large stretch of it, and so it's really difficult through the way that we traditionally do floodplain management to capture these cumulative effects of subsequent stack developments along the river. But what you end up with from a habitat perspective is really death by 1,000 cuts, and it becomes impossible to say, well, okay, it was this permitting decision where things started to go bad. Like these certain things were okay, but at this point it wasn't. That's just really not part of how we do things traditionally. But it is something we have to start thinking about now that we have these higher standards and we're thinking about the habitat impacts of not only each development, but the cumulative effects of what we are allowing to happen along our rivers. So how do we balance the rights of private property owners and the desire of private property owners to, develop their properties with our stewardship of these public resources, these waterways, these rivers? And, we're pretty familiar with how to do that here in Washington State and Puget Sound. We have the shoreline buffers, and that's a pretty traditional local planning way to deal with those, with balancing those two different sort of pressures. So here we have pictures of the shoreline buffer areas for Seattle, Thurston County, and Berrien. And I bring these up because what the BiOp requires us to do is to start thinking about the SFHA in similar terms as these kind of buffers where we need to think about larger scale habitat impacts, even though we're permitting on that project by project basis. So there's a lot of existing environmental regulations like the Shoreline, master plan that local communities are already fully implementing, and and it's a fair question of whether or not the BiOp requirements and habitat requirements that are required for the consideration of ESA species are already covered by those existing requirements. And I guess my answer to that would be maybe, but probably not. And the reason that I say probably not, there are some potential problems with just relying on your existing regulations to cover these requirements. One of them is exemptions. An example is with Shoreline. If a project doesn't cost a certain amount, then there's that threshold there where anything below that gets an exemption. And I know that there are shoreline exemption letters and stuff that, that do condition the project still, but we got to make sure that if a project is receiving a shoreline exemption, that the floodplain permitting requirements don't fall through. There might be different definitions in different portions of your regulations. An example of which is Shoreline and the NFIP define the term floodway differently. It's a small, difference, but we've got to keep an eye on those as well and make sure that the NFIP definitions are applied to floodplain management. There are some administrative and subjective decisions that can happen in these other programs that may not be appropriate for the NFIP. And then the reports that you're used to seeing, they may not cover everything that the BiOp requires. And the BiOp, being an ESA document, has some specific requirements and specific metrics that are probably not met in these reports already. And so what I really want to emphasize, though, is that we're aware that there's already a lot of really awesome things happening at the local level, and the effort just needs to be in making sure that you have cross references, that you build out some stop gaps, and make sure there's a way that you can operate these in a way where the NFIP requirements don't fall through the cracks. And I really want to emphasize that it's not in our interest to be requiring you to duplicate processes, and we don't want you to create redundancies. We just want to make sure that things are stitched together really well. So just to revisit some of the real basics, floodplain development permits are required for almost everything. In an earlier module, Aaron had our definition of development. It really does cover a vast array of different activities. So pretty much everything is going to require floodplain development review, and that includes restoration projects. That includes projects that are that the purpose of which is expressly to improve habitat for salmon. Even those need permits. There's been some confusion in the past about projects that qualify for WDFW's streamlined HPA permit, which the law that established, which says that if a project qualifies for that particular permit, that local permits and fees are not allowed for those. But that was some confusing language that was never approved by FEMA, and so floodplain permits cannot be waived really for anything that qualifies as development in the special flood hazard area. And so in this spring's legislature amended that law to make clear that the permitting and review required as mandatory for a community's participation in the NFIP still needed to happen for those projects, even if they qualified for that permit. Permit applications, you really got to consider them incomplete without a habitat assessment, and that's a helpful way to think about it. That these habitat assessments and this additional analysis that you need to be requiring of applicants is just that additional information that you're entitled to as a floodplain administrator in order to have all the information you need to be confident that your permitting decisions are going to be consistent with your regulations. And permitting development without confirming ESA compliance can jeopardize a community's continued participation in the NFIP. We unpack this a little bit more in the next module, but these are requirements for your community, and they really need to be a fundamental part of how you are thinking about the development in your flood hazard areas. So yeah, just an emphasis that this is additional information that you need to be requiring from an applicant. This is not your job to make an argument for the ESA compliance of a project that you're reviewing. This is something that, I'm hoping that you'll have more confidence to volley back, an application and consider it incomplete until you have all the information that you need. So what does ESA compliance mean for NFIP communities? And when I talk about ESA compliance, it's the same as anything else with NFIP compliance. It's helpful to think about it in terms of if I come into your community for a community assistance visit, which is the NFIP mechanism for, coming to a community and doing an inventory and a look at the program to make sure that that you're meeting the basic standards, and then or to identify any places where you need some additional technical support. So let's say I come in for a CAV and I'm asking questions about certain projects. Some of the documentation that I'm going to be asking for is the traditional, where's your permit? What's the application? What went into your decision, to approve this project? And part of that documentation is going to need to be, to address ESA compliance. So You're going to need documentation of the following: that all of your permitting decisions involve the appropriate level of habitat assessment, meaning the complexity and the rigor of that analysis fits, in scale, your project. We'll talk about that a little bit as we go on, and that no development was allowed in your SFHA that either made it harder for salmon populations to recover or that left habitat worse in quality and function than it was before. The second part is important because the BiOp doesn't require us to make things better than they were before. I mean, we would all hope that that would be the case as often as possible, but the BiOp just requires us to have a real detailed idea of the quality and function of habitat at any location of proposed development before that development, so that we can then weigh any potential impacts of the proposal against what's there at that point. So documentation. And there's lots of different ways you can arrive at that documentation. We'll break that down a little bit from now, but you should just have the confidence that your permit file is going to demonstrate how you have gone through this process to review it, and that it was part of what helped you arrive at your decision to approve development. So habitat assessments, this is what we're going to talk about when we get into them specifically. What is a habitat assessment? Habitat assessments and how they should inform permitting decisions, and then what is not a habitat assessment. So this is a super important resource that that we hope that anyone who's even remotely interested in the topics we're covering in this series of modules will get their hands on. It's a regional guidance that we developed for floodplain habitat assessment and mitigation. Everything that you need to know and understand about regulating your floodplain development with these extra considerations in mind are in this document. It's a robust document, and it will help you evaluate habitat assessments. It breaks down the language of what needs to be in there, what kind of analysis is required, what kind of determinations and conclusions, to look for in them. And it's just a really handy guide. If you got nothing more out of these modules than the name of this document and our email addresses, that would be huge, because really everything in here will help you with this. It's also a great resource for providing to applicants or to biologists that are hired by those applicants to fill out these reports, because the habitat assessment is not like a set defined document or product that's available out there in the market to go purchase, right? It's a very specific report that speaks specifically to the Puget Sound BiOp and what we need to be worried about for, to protect our threatened species and their critical habitat. So super helpful to get it out there in the community so that applicants and biologists that write these reports are aware of those requirements. It's really tough as a permitter to get a report in that a lot has gone into, that a lot of money has been spent on, and then have to be like, okay, this is great, but here are all the things that it's missing that I need because this is an ESA level analysis. Yeah, and another great thing that this thing does is, it's not, as local planners, most of us don't have, a background in biology, right? And sometimes it can be hard to even formulate the questions. Like you can read a habitat assessment and get a sense that it doesn't have everything that's needed, but it's hard to figure out how to ask that, right? Well, this guide will help. It will give you the vocabulary. It will line out what you need to be worried about so that you can then be clear when you're trying to let an applicant know what's missing and what information is still required. And really, my central thesis in this whole module is that you don't have to be a biologist to do this. You shouldn't have to be a biologist to understand a habitat assessment. They should be presented in common sense language. Their arguments and determinations should be easy to grasp based on, the habitats that's there and the proposed development. So if you don't understand it, it is not you. It is not your fault. Continue to volley back, have more conversations, ask more questions until you feel confident, because like any floodplain development, it's really on the applicant to convince you as a permitter why this project can happen and not place the community at risk and not place their neighbors at risk. It's not your job to make that argument. It's theirs. So similarly with the habitat stuff, don't be intimidated by it. Keep asking questions until you feel confident, because this stuff should be presentable and digestible from a common sense viewpoint. So what is really a habitat assessment? Well, it's an answer essentially to 3 questions. What is the current condition of habitat at the site prior to the proposed development? What is the applicant proposing to do, right? So what do they want to do so that you can weigh those impacts of that proposal. And then 3, how will the applicant make sure that the habitat condition and function will be at least as good as it was before? So these are the 3 questions that a habitat assessment should answer. There are specifics about how they need to go about answering them. There's some rules and some vocabulary involved, but essentially this is what a habitat assessment should accomplish. So the first question, what's the current condition of habitat at the site? I mentioned this a little bit before, but it's that snapshot of everything that's there before. So the guide that I mentioned before has all the science. So when the services list a species as threatened or endangered, one of the things that they do is they provide a list of all of the aspects and characteristics of that species habitat that are most important for its recovery and survival. And the flip side being that those aspects of their habitat are also the most sensitive, that if there's damage done to these particular needs, that's going to be of the most damage to that species potential for recovery and survival. So that's all in the guide. We'll touch on those a little bit as they apply to salmon, but rely on the guide for those. So when you read the description of the current conditions of habitat at the site, those should be in there. You know, what's water quality look like? You know, do we have a lot of filtering vegetation there? You know, spawning gravel and those sorts of things. These sound really super heavy science stuff, but there should be a pretty detailed description of them that you can then compare against what's needed for salmon by looking at those parts of the guide. Questions to ask yourself as you're reading through this part of the habitat assessment. What level of development and modification already exists, right? That's really important because if you've got an area that's already pretty highly modified, already got a lot of development there, maybe there's already you know, graveled areas or impacted, you know, packed down soils, maybe the filtering capabilities of the soils are already not super great, but maybe, you know, think about how much vegetation's there, because once you understand that, it's easier to start thinking in your mind how steep the mountain is for somebody to be able to make an argument to you that the habitat that's there is going to be in at least as good a condition as it is afterward, right? If you have an area that's got a lot of function, a lot of riparian vegetation already, doesn't have a lot of disturbance, well, it's going to be a lot more work to convince you that all of that is going to be just as good afterward. Whereas on the flip side of it, you may not need as much analysis and as much additional information to explain how remaining habitat functions at a really highly developed area are going to be protected. So that's something to think about real early on as you're reading one of these reports. The second question that a habitat assessment should answer is, what is the applicant proposing to do? And what really needs to be in this section is a detailed description of the whole project. I've looked at a number of habitat assessments that communities have sent me to look over for support of them, you know, meeting these requirements. And a real common problem is a missing description of all the things that are going to happen. I mean, there's the obvious things like, you know, the permanent improvements, right? You look at this house on the left and, you know, all the things are going to be there after the project is complete. But I've seen habitat assessments that are even missing that. They may not have the footprints of the structures. They certainly, you know, if they don't have the footprints of the structures or, you know, or a site plan, it's unlikely that they're going to have volumes of fill and other things that are really important to know. So you need to have all the permanent improvements, but it's also really useful to have information about future use. You know, is this going to be a commercial development or residential development? Is that commercial development going to bring additional traffic to the river? Is it going to be a bed and breakfast that's going to have a bunch of fishermen along the river? So future use is important for reasons we'll talk about in a minute about thinking about, you know, long-term effects of development. Also really important are all the construction activities that need to occur to arrive at this house, you know, to have this house on the side of there. So temporary impacts such as the staging of materials, temporary access, what kind of equipment is going to be on site and where is it going to be used, the best management practices to minimize habitat impacts while construction is underway. All of those things need to be lined out in that description, and the entire impact area needs to be considered. That entire impacted area within the SFHA has got to be part of that description. And question 3, how will the applicant make sure that the habitat condition and function will be at least as good as it was before? the first thing to think about is how has the applicant designed the project to cause as little impact to habitat as possible. This is also something that's often missing from these, because what usually happens is a developer or a property owner decides what they want to do, and then they hire a biologist to come in and analyze the impacts of that. Well, there's a huge missing part there. It needs to be really clear that the applicant has considered habitat impacts in the design of their project, that that has gone into where they're placing things and how much is going in there. So the design, there needs to be an explanation of how that's been part of the design of the project, and then whatever remaining potential impacts after they've thought about those things, and how will they be addressed is the other part of that. So when we're looking at both of these things, both in how is the project designed to minimize impacts, and then how are the remaining impacts addressed, we need them to follow what's known as the mitigation sequence. The mitigation sequence is sort of a sequence of strategies that you have to follow in order when you're looking at potential habitat impacts. The first one is avoid, which means that before anything else, how have you avoided negative impacts as much as possible? That's not causing them at all. So that's not causing them and fixing them. That's just not causing them in the first place. So that's avoid. After you've avoided impacts as much as makes sense, then you can go to minimize. So steps must be taken to minimize any impacts at that point. Minimize, really, that's like best management practices, buffers, locating the footprint of development as far away from sensitive habitat areas as possible, having minimized them happening in the first place. So after you've considered both those, if there's impacts that cannot be avoided or minimized, then any lost functions must be repaired or replaced. And this is, we actually we actually think about a lot more often as compensatory mitigation, right? Because what was damaged and what can we do to put it back? But that's in repair. So you got to look at where things have been destroyed or lost or degraded, and how are you going to patch it up to where the function is going to be at least as good as it was before, function and quality. And then for any remaining impacts, after you follow those first three steps, that's the only point at which mitigation and compensatory mitigation or compensatory mitigation is appropriate to be considered. So there's three types of effects. I mentioned this a little bit before. The first of which is, direct effects that need to be considered. And those are pretty obvious. Those are, I'm going to put a house in here. So how's a house going to affect, habitat impacts, or how's a new driveway, or additional impervious surfaces going to affect habitat? Well, that's kind of the easy, clear ones, but we also need to consider indirect effects, and those are likely to occur later in time or outside the area directly affected by the proposed activities. An easy example of that is if we have additional impervious surfaces, that's going to produce additional runoff, right? So we have more water running off, we have less water being absorbed into the soils at that point. Do we have a water quality issue? A water quantity issue? Is there enough impervious surfaces to where we're actually going to have more water running directly into the river than we did before? The third is cumulative effects. And this one is the hardest because it's the most alien to how we do floodplain management sort of traditionally. And I touched on this right at the beginning of the presentation, that we have to find a way to capture the lingering effects of past actions and the anticipated effects of current actions. So we've got effects that are overlapping in time and space. And so this stuff is hard. But, if you think about it, like, every time we permit development, it's in our mind that, there's a precedent set, right? I mentioned in the beginning that, when a neighbor sees another neighbor put something in, is that going to make it more likely that there's going to be pressure on the community to continue to permit similar development, right? And does the community have the ability and the sort of tracking resources available to have a sense of when too much is too much, right? Another example is when we're permitting the building a house on, a bluff or near a shoreline or whatever else, the house at the time may seem like it's a safe distance, but by allowing that house there, are we then more likely to have to allow a bulkhead later to protect it, right? So we just need to think about things in a larger way, both spatially and time-wise. And that's how we start to think about cumulative effects, avoiding that death by 1,000 cuts that I talked about earlier. So we're super used to seeing direct effects, in our descriptions of projects, but these other two are often missing. So applicants and and contractors that they hire are likely going to need some education about these additional kinds of effects that they need to consider. So a habitat assessment must always do the following things, and these are characteristics of a good habitat assessment. So the first one being, it should demonstrate knowledge of the habitat functions that must be protected, and those are all in the guide. So when you're reading a habitat assessment, if you've got familiarity with your guide, you should be like, oh, it should be pretty familiar. They should be knocking out those same specific characteristics that are most important to salmon in their analysis. It needs to evaluate all development activities for all potential negative impacts. That's also something that's pretty easy to kind of get a grasp on right away when you're looking at it. If you're looking at it and the project description is missing major details, then you know that you have something that's going to be, it's not going to cover things in much detail, because if you don't know everything that's proposed to happen at a site, what impacts are they going to analyze, right? If they don't know what they are evaluating, how likely is the evaluation going to give you all the information you need to know? So not very. So that's another quick thing to notice, that maybe that's a good point at which you volley back and say, I'm going to need a better description of what's happening before I look at the rest of this. It should explain how protecting current habitat and function was part of the project design. We talked about that. That really needs to be in there, because when you're going through that mitigation sequence, decisions about what you're actually going to build and where you're going to build it should be part of it. So why, having gone through thinking about habitat impacts, why is this your best proposal for what you want to do with your property? And then, of course, explain how the condition and function of the habitat will be at least as good in all aspects, and those aspects are listed in the guide, as it was before. So these are characteristics of a solid habitat assessment. So how does this figure into your actual permitting decisions? What's even allowable, based on what you're seeing in these assessment reports? So the primary one being, is habitat going to be at least as good as what was before? And that needs to be in all of these characteristics: in quality, quantity, availability, function, and connection. And your answer needs to be yes on all of these. If you're going to issue a permit, it needs to be backed up by documentation. So let's just break this down just a little bit from a common sense viewpoint. So quality of habitat, that one's pretty easy. Are we going to have similar amounts of riparian vegetation there? Are the are the functions from that front going to be as good as they were before? Quantity is an important one, because one of the characteristics of habitat that salmon really, really require is called flood refuge. And what that means is, when we have that base flood, that 1% annual chance flood, and the waters are going to come up over the banks, that overbank area that's now inundated with floodwaters is really important for salmon to have access to, as refuge from those higher currents during a flood event, debris and whatnot. And so that flood refuge that's available to them has to be preserved in quantity as well as quality, right? So if you're putting anything into that area, you're reducing the quantity, the volume of area that's available to them for flood refuge. So how is that going to be offset so that you're still at least as good as it was before? Availability speaks both to the flood refuge, but it also speaks to floodplain connection, right? So when FEMA comes in and maps an area, we might map the Snohomish River, but the Snohomish River has a ton of little tributaries and on side channels that might not be mapped, but those are really important to salmon, having access to those side channels as well. So those need to be, maintained, availability of that, of those side channel floodplain habitats and whatnot. So all of these things need to be considered. An important thing to watch for is a proposal that says, you know what, we're going to make this one thing so much better that we don't need to worry about the loss of another habitat function, right? So we're going to plant so much new native vegetation that we don't need to worry about the fact that we've put in enough fill and development, that we've reduced the availability and quantity of flood refuge available for salmon. Because and a way that I like to think about this is, if you've got 3 houses, right, and they're all in pretty poor condition, if you raise those 3 houses, get rid of them, and put 2 houses back that are really nice, yeah, you have you've got better quality habitat, right? But you only have room for 2 families, whereas before you had room for 3, right? So you can't we can't do that trade-off, because it doesn't matter how much better you make one, the loss of this other aspect is going to hurt. Because if you remember, I said that the services come up with this list based on what things are most important to salmon, and if they're hurt, will do damage, right? So making one really great is not going to offset the damage you're doing in that other aspect. So here's the actual list of what's most important to salmon according to the services in their habitat. We're not going to go into this too much, so don't stress if you don't have a science background, you're worried about this. You can go into the guide and you can learn a ton more about it. It's got a lot of information, but the reason I put this up is because there's another way to look at them. Let's look at them through the lens of some common floodplain development activities that we're all real familiar with. First being new impervious surfaces, right? So additional paved, not only just additional paved areas, but when you put in gravel areas, even though it seems like they're still going to be pervious and porous, we're impacting the soil to put in, like a new gravel parking lot or driveway. So that's going to be less pervious, less able to absorb and filter water than it was before. So new impervious surfaces themselves, which one of these components are they going to affect, right? More than half of them, blam, 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 are going to be affected by impervious surface or have the potential to be affected. And so there's going to need to be analysis in that report on those. Let's add one more. Let's add good old fill. If we got fill, that covers all the rest of them. Okay, so just with impervious surfaces and fill, we've ticked every one of the key habitat components that are most important to salmon. So the takeaway from that is that any kind of floodplain development is likely to need analysis, right? If almost all floodplain development can impact habitat, then almost every project is going to require mitigation of those impacts. Okay, so that's true. So the viewpoint is, all right, floodplain management affects habitat. So any kind of proposal we have is going to have to tell us how they're going to offset those impacts or take care of them. They're going to have to follow the mitigation sequence: avoid, minimize, repair, compensate, right? Right, except that the BiOp creates in the Puget Sound communities something called a protected area. It's a subset of the special flood hazard area that NIMS has told us, in order for floodplain management to continue without further jeopardizing species or adversely modifying their critical habitat, there needs to be a portion of the special flood hazard area where we reduce as much as possible impacts. NIMS would like it to be a no disturbance zone, so that, because any negative impacts in those areas are going to so negatively impact salmon as to continue to put us in jeopardy, right, of making their lives worse. So in the protected area, what that means is all you have available to you in the mitigation sequence is avoid. Like, you cannot cause effects that would then need to be, mitigated or compensated. You have to avoid those effects altogether. And I want to put a hook in here for the next module, is that if your community chooses to go the route of a door-to programmatic habitat assessment, which we'll talk about, then there is room to mitigate for adverse effects in the protected area. But just from a basic BiOp assumptions of a community's existing regulations to protect the environment, that protected area needs to be a no disturbance zone. So how do we define where the protected area is? Well, it's going to depend based on the location in your community. The protected area is defined by whichever of these three areas extend the farthest from ordinary high water without going outside the SFHA, because the BiOp does not change the jurisdiction of the NFIP. We're still, the special flood hazard area defines that jurisdiction. So we follow these areas out looking for their boundary until we get to the SFHA, and then we stop there. But so these areas are made up by the floodway, of the channel migration zone plus 50 feet, and of the riparian buffer zone. So let's dig into that a little bit more. We're all pretty familiar with the floodway. If there's a mapped floodway in that area, that's going to make up part of the protected area. The channel migration zone. So if you look at this picture, each one of these colored little squiggly lines are the location of that river in a certain decade, right? So this looks over past a number of decades, and this is where the river is, at each one of those decades. And not, so we're not talking about geologic time. We're not talking about where it was a century ago. We're talking about the natural behavior of a river to meander and occasionally avulse into those little, oxbows there at the left. So the channel migration zone defines that entire area where that river is likely to be meandering and snaking about. So channel migration zone plus 50 feet is another part of the protected area. And then we have the riparian buffer zone. And these are zones that are measured equally from ordinary high water along a river or along a waterway. And the width of that is defined by the type of the waterway. So water body. So we have shorelines of the state that are going to be 250 feet from ordinary high water, marine shorelines and salmon streams that are greater than 5 feet wide. Those are both going to be 200 feet from ordinary high water. And then lake shorelines and salmon streams that are less than 5 feet wide are both 150 feet. So this is what it looks like on a river, which is to the right, and then in a marine or coastal situation on the left there. So it's measured that equal distance from ordinary high all along that water body. So determining the extent of the protected area. So this is all of these layers, these areas overlapped, and it's real messy and complicated. And so in this next little section, we're going to talk about how to break these down and figure out whether or not a proposed project is inside the protected area. So we have the floodway, which is this big yellow blob underneath everything. We have the riparian buffer zone, the RBZ, which is defined by those two green stripes. And then those two orange lines are the outside of the channel migration zone plus 50 feet. So those are our three areas superimposed on top of the special flood hazard area, which is the giant red blob behind. So you may be thinking, well, what if we don't have a mapped channel migration zone? And we'll get to that in just a moment, but we're going to assume that at this location, we do have a mapped CMZ, so we can work with that as well. So let's think about this. So let's take a hypothetical house, this little house here. Do you think that this house is located in the protected area? And I'm just going to give us just a little minute for you to think about it based on what I showed you before as far as the locations of the floodway, the riparian buffer zone, and the channel migration zone. So the way to determine this is to ask yourself a series of questions. The first of which is always going to be, is it in the SFHA, right? Because if it's not in the SFHA, it's not within NFIP jurisdiction. It might be in the jurisdiction of other existing regulations that you have on the books, but I work for FEMA. I'm talking about the NFIP. So if it's not in the SFHA, these, our requirements don't apply. So is it in the SFHA? This house clearly is. So we got a giant red SFHA that stretches quite a ways from ordinary high. Next question, is it in the floodway? One of our parts of the protected area. Here's the floodway again. Thank goodness the house is outside the floodway because we don't want houses in the floodway. Is it in the riparian buffer zone? And those green stripes. It's clearly in the riparian buffer zone. That's a yes. And at that point, if you get a yes on any of these, yes, you're in the protected area. But just for the sake of walking through this exercise, let's ask the last question, and that's whether or not it's in the CMZ. In this case, we have a very wide CMZ defined by those orange lines. It is also in the CMZ, yes. We get a house that's in the protected area, and so those additional requirements will apply. And we'll go into those a little bit more too. So what about this house? Is this house in the protected area? Give you just a moment to think about it. Okay, let's go through those questions that we asked ourselves before. Is the house in the SFHA? Clearly that's a yes, it's inside that red zone. Is it in the floodway? Well, it's not too far from the floodway, but it is outside the floodway in that location. It's in the riparian buffer zone. It's outside the green area, it's not in the riparian buffer zone. And then the final question is it in the channel migration zone plus 50 feet? That's where that is. It is also outside of those. So we have a house that is not in the protected area. The important thing to remember right here is that that does not mean that there are not habitat impact analyses that are required for this project. There certainly still are. They're just not the strict avoid all adverse impacts that apply to the protected area. So when you're considering a project where it's like a house or a point specific thing, it's handiest to ask, is it in or is it out, right? But when we're thinking about larger projects or impact areas or land use decisions, it's helpful to be able to understand the entire boundary of it. So here I've drawn a dotted line to indicate the protected area on this particular map, and we're just going to walk through a couple points and talk about how I defined its extent at that point. Here, this one's pretty easy. We're well outside the floodway, we're well outside the RBZ, and we continue out through the SFHA until we arrive at the boundary of the CMZ plus 50 feet. And so that is going to be the limit of the extent of the protected area at that location on that side of the river. What about on the other side of the river? Well, here we're outside the floodway, we're outside the RBZ, but before we get to the channel migration zone plus 50 feet line, we've run out of SFHA. So that's where we draw the line. So at that location on that side of the river, the entire SFHA at that cross section would be considered protected area. Here we have a similar situation where the SFHA and the floodway look like they're really close to being the same. You have those sections where your SFHA will bottleneck and floodway will extend the whole way. So there we've gone to the edge of the floodway, and that's also where the SFHA, the regulatory floodplain, ends. And so even though we have the RBZ that extends much further and that the CMZ that extends even further than that, we're still going to end right there at the boundary of the SFHA, and then we have protected area for the entire extent at that point on that side of the river. Here too, even though the CMZ extends, pretty far, is pretty close to the river there, we have RBZ that comes out, but then we end at the boundary of the SFHA right at that point. And then here, the floodway extends further than both the CMZ and the RBZ, and it's still within the SFHA. So the boundary of the floodway right there is what defines where I would draw that dotted line. So I mentioned before about whether or not your community has an adopted CMZ. What we're looking at right here, this dotted line defines the protected area on this map if there is an adopted mapped CMZ. But NIMS has told us that if we don't have an idea of where that channel migration zone has been mapped, then we need to assume that the channel migration zone is the entirety of the SFHA at that point. So this is what you have if you don't have a mapped CMZ. This is what you have for protected area. I'm sorry, I misspoke. This is what you have if you do have a mapped CMZ. This is what you have if you don't have a mapped CMZ. If you don't have any information on your channel migration zone, you're stuck with the entire extent of the SFHA as your protected area because NIMS has determined that that's what you need to assume. That's going to be the possible meandering behavior of that waterway would be the entirety of the base flood area. So key habitat components, these are all those things most important to salmon in the protected area. You need to avoid all adverse effects to these. They're so important and so sensitive that we cannot even allow adverse effects that we could then mitigate for. We just need to make sure that they are protected in the protected area. In the rest of the SFHA, the mitigation sequence must be followed for any adverse effects to anything on the list. So outside of the protected area, adverse effects can occur, but you need to be looking for that in the design and then in the mitigation of those effects so that the mitigation sequence has been followed. Again, just a little bit of hook here that, if your community goes the door to programmatic habitat assessment route, there may be room for mitigating effects. We'll talk about that in the next module. So the other important thing that needs to be in these habitat assessments is something called an effects determination. It's an ESA specific conclusion regarding how a project will impact species and habitat. And it's really just an important thing to be in there because that is kind of like the overall conclusion of impacts from an ESA perspective. And the effects determination comes in 3 types. We've got no effect, an NE, got may affect, not likely to adversely affect, we usually say NLAA, and then we got likely to adversely affect. Let's break those down a little bit. So no effect means it. That means no effect whatsoever. So even a project, that has beneficial effects cannot be a no effect. No effect is you're a million miles from a river, you don't know what a salmon is, you're nowhere near it. So no effect means it. Second one is may affect, not likely to adversely affect. So if you've got a project for which all of the impacts have been mitigated, you're going to be at may affect, not likely to adversely affect, regardless of your confidence of whether or not those, those impacts may actually happen. Like I said, even a project that has only beneficial effects, the best it can do is may affect, not likely to adversely affect, because you are still having an effect, right? So the NLAA determination means that any remaining negative effects are either insignificant or discountable. What that means is that a person would not be able to meaningfully measure, detect, or evaluate insignificant effects or expect discountable effects to occur. So that just breaks down those ESA specific terms. Likely to adverse effect means that that the effects of the project will result in short or long-term adverse effects on listed species or designated critical habitat. That means after the project is complete, there are still long-term adverse effects or short-term adverse effects that have not been addressed or mitigated. So no effect is going to be super rare in floodplain development. As I just said, no effect means nothing whatsoever. So the idea that a no effect could happen in floodplain development is pretty hard to imagine. A likely to adversely affect, no permit is allowed for that. That is a deal breaker, end of the conversation. Well, not end of the conversation, because if you can ask for a project to go back and be redesigned, but you're never going to see a likely to adversely affect, because anyone writing these reports is going to understand that that's a deal breaker. So, but you need to be keeping an eye out for things that people are claiming are NLAA, but actually are LAA, because they may be disregarding certain habitat effects. They may be doing that bait and switch where it says, these 2 houses are really fancy, so you shouldn't worry about the fact that we used to have 3, right? So you want to keep an eye out for that, but you're not likely to see those. So most habitat assessments are going to have a determination of may affect, not likely to adversely affect, which means that they need a mitigation plan. And that's their plan of how they're going to deal with those potential impacts that may be caused by that proposed development. So just as a reminder, in the protected area, there's not going to be a mitigation plan, right? Because you're not going to have effects that need to be mitigated in the first place. But, except maybe if you go a door-to programmatic habitat assessment route. But if you, for any impacts that are in the SFHA outside of the protected area, you're going to need to have a mitigation plan that's going to explain all of this. First of which being how impacts were avoided to the greatest extent practicable. That's in the design of the project, and then in the activities and that whole detailed description of what's being proposed. The mitigation sequence should be clear throughout. So have you avoided them? How will you minimize them? We talked a little bit about ways you can minimize impacts, and that's keeping the footprint away from high value habitat areas, designating buffer areas that won't be disturbed. Other best management practices include native vegetation measures around active use areas, and then strictly observe species specific work windows. So this is not a complete list, but these are the kind of things you're looking at for how impacts have been minimized. Right, and then describe those BMPs employed in construction activities. Just saying BMPs will be employed doesn't really tell you very much, right? What BMPs and how will they be employed and why? Why is that a good strategy for dealing with the impacts that you're worried about, right? Repair, replace habitat functions that were degraded by project actions. Wetlands and channels and riparian areas can be potentially repaired and rebuilt after activities have disturbed them, such as clearance, grading, and filling. And all areas temporarily cleared should be revegetated with native plants. So repair and replace can be part of that as well. Compensatory mitigation. So after exhausting the prior 3 mitigation strategies, that's when it's appropriate to start thinking about compensating from any remaining impacts. So in-kind on-site compensation, which is synonymous with replacement, is preferred. And the measures must account for key habitat components. I mentioned this earlier, that you can't just address your favorite of the key habitat components, or the one that's easiest to address. And you can't go super over, achiever on one thing and then argue that that makes not accounting for impacts to the others okay, right? All of those key habitat components that were impacted by the development have to be equally addressed. To restore them to at least as good a condition and function as they were before the proposal or before the development. And this applies both to compensatory mitigation and to repair replace, what we just talked about before. So what's required for a lost function is likely going to be more than what was the amount of damage done. And if you think about it this way, so fully grown in patch of of wetland or riparian vegetation, if you remove that and replant it, it is going to be years before that is grown in and functioning at the same level as what was there before. And so the way to handle that is to do more, right? So from what you've taken away, put back more to try, to offset how long it's going to take for that stuff to get back to its full function. So the compensation required for loss likely needs to be more than the damage that was done. So what a habitat assessment is not. This is a list of classic fails that I see regularly, actually, in habitat assessments. The first of which being something we already talked about, a vague project description without building dimensions, volumes of fill, site map, etc. Again, if you don't actually know what the impacts you're supposed to be assessing, what impacts are you assessing, right? What's the point of the report if you don't have a detailed understanding of what is being proposed? The next one is another kind of classic one. It's that you'll see the argument, we're not doing any in-water work, which means we're not going to kill any salmon, which means our project has no effect. And there's a way to think of this as possibly a reasonable, it makes sense why this would show up, because generally the standard for private entities and non-federal agencies is what we call no take, right? It's an ESA standard that says that no species will be harmed or harassed in this project. And so I guess that's why they think that that is a viable argument. But from everything that we've covered in this module and the earlier modules, we're not just talking about whether or not you're going to kill a fish. We're talking about making sure that you are not degrading or adverse modifying their critical habitat that is desperately essential for them to recover and survive. So that doesn't fly. No in-water work equaling no effect. No, that's a fail. Missing an effects determination. This one's pretty innocent because, if you're not familiar with ESA language, if they haven't read the guide, then it may be that you're missing that effects determination, but you need it in a habitat assessment. They need to take responsibility for their analysis and for their methods. And, the way that they do that is they pick that stamp of that effects determination and say that this is the conclusion of all of my analysis. Ignoring that habitat functions can still be present in highly developed degraded areas. That's a really important one. Just because a site has seen agricultural use for decades, or maybe it's already pretty developed, there's already a lot of impervious surfaces, whatnot. There may be sites at which not all of those key habitat components are in place and functioning, but there's always going to be something there. There's always going to be flood refuge, for instance, right? So when you have a flood and the waters overrun the banks, it doesn't matter if it does matter in quality wise if that's paved area or if it's agricultural area, whatever. That volume of flood refuge is still available to those salmon, even if it's not as great as it could be, right? So you still have that habitat function. You still have maybe spawning gravel. You still have to think about water quality, right? Even if there's already problems with water quality, even if there's already runoff problems happening, you can't make those worse. So there's still going to be habitat functions to consider no matter how developed or degraded the area is. So just saying it's already terrible doesn't mean that you get a skip habitat assessment. Compensatory mitigation is less than what was lost. We just talked about that one. That's an important one to keep an eye on. The mitigation sequence is not followed. No alternatives considered. That's a real common one of this is how I want to build, but these are the other alternatives I considered, and this is how I arrived at this decision. That is often missing from these assessments. And then no knowledge of the protected area, which is another pretty innocent one. If somebody hasn't read the guide, getting the guide out to people, is important to that. Having those, pre-application meetings, whatever way you can do to educate your community so that these aren't, unhappy surprises when you finally get an application. So no knowledge of the protected area is a pretty common one and a pretty rough one, especially if a good amount of the development they're proposing is in the protected area. They're all classic fails. And if you see them, don't be afraid to send them back. Don't be afraid to ask more questions, to volley back, because these are not any of these problems are deal breakers. Any of these problems mean that the habitat assessment you received is not adequate to your needs, to give you the information you need to make your decisions. So to sort of wrap up this module, here's some important things to remember about habitat assessments. The first being scale. The length and complexity of a habitat assessment needs to be proportionate to the potential impacts of that project. And this is really important because, you know, not every project is going to require a 150-page habitat assessment, right? Some of them will, but what does that depend on? That depends on the condition of habitat, the quality and function of habitat at the site before the proposed development, right? And then that makes sense. You know, if you got an untouched area, the distance that they have to cross to convince you that the habitat's going to be at least as good as it was before is going to be pretty far. And it's going to require a lot of analysis, a lot of argument, and a lot of effort to get you to the point where you're confident that their analysis is correct. The other end of it being, if you've got a project that's not going to cause a lot of impact, let's say you're replacing pilings, or you're doing some kind of maintenance project where, let's say, the construction activities you might need to have an eye on those to make sure that they don't make anything worse. But there's a lot of projects I can imagine where the amount and complexity of the habitat analysis that would be appropriate is not very much at all. So it's all going to depend on, scaling it to the potential impacts of the project. Second one, current conditions. I've been really firing this with home, but it's really important. It's all about comparing impacts or weighing impacts against what is already there. You don't have to make it better, right? You don't have to imagine what it could be. You have to know what's there in detail so that you can make sure it's as good as it was before. Taking into consideration existing development and modifications already, what are the impairments that are already in place. And then the final one, and really the one that's closest to my heart, is common sense, is that habitat assessments should provide logical, common sense explanations for their analyses and determinations. It should make sense. If it doesn't make sense, keep asking questions. It is on the applicant to convince you that their project is not going to put your community in the position where it is approving development that makes things worse for species and their habitat. So they should make sense. Don't feel intimidated. Don't feel dumb if you don't get it. If you don't, then they have not done their job, and they need to do their job better to help you arrive at a yes. If that's what they want to, if they want you to get to a yes for their development, that is on them. Get me to a yes. Convince me this will work. Explain this to me, right? So that's just really important to me, that you should not have to be a biologist to be able to process these things. So that wraps up our module on habitat assessments. The next module is going to go into, now that you understand what weight is on your shoulders in terms of, integrating habitat assessment into your floodplain management, what are some strategies that your community can use to make this easier? How can you get this baked into your program enough to where it's not so much work, to where you have some passive compliance, you have outreach happening that makes your life easier when you're meeting these requirements?